My name is Tina, and today I will be talking about the scientific advances in daily life and the public education in the 20th century. During the late 1800s, technology greatly advanced in the North. By the turn of the 20th century, 40% of Americans lived a city life rather than the 19th century agricultural and industrial age. One of the most prominent advances in technology was the agricultural ability to build skyscrapers. The first designer of the 10 or more story building was Louis Sullivan. A very popular example of an early 20th century skyscraper is the Flatiron Building. The growth of transportation was also an important contributing factor in city planning. For example, 100,000 New Yorkers commuted to the central business district using electric transit every day. Another growing form of transportation was by plane. The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, designed the internal combustion engine that was the first of its kind to keep an aircraft aloft. Around the same time, mass printing became a necessary factor to the growing literacy rate of the American people. This also influenced the photography industry. The commonly known camera brand of today, Kodak, was influenced by George Eastman to further enhance the appreciation of technological growth. With technological growth in early 20th century America came the advancement of public education. By early 1900s, 500,000 students enrolled in high school. Many of them were a part of the approximate 10 million immigrants in the United States. Architect Frederick Law Olmsted planned urban parks, bringing urbanization to the cities. Here lies the Flatiron Building, intersecting on 5th Avenue and 23rd Street in New York. Orville and Wilbur Wright, bicycle manufacturers that experimented with engines, made a glider. This is an internal combustion engine, a 4-cylinder covering 120 feet, lasting for 12 seconds. Because in 1890, the literacy rate rose to 90%. Books, magazines, and newspapers became higher in demand. Here is the electronically powered press, printing on a continuous paper roll. George Eastman created the Kodak camera. In 1888, it sold for $25 for a 100-picture roll of film. Between 1865 and 1895, states required 12 to 16 weeks annually of school between the ages of 8 and 14. They learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, but had strict rules, which were physical punishment. Blacks became excluded from public secondary education. In 1890, less than 1% of black teenagers attended high school. In 1910, about 3% of African Americans from 15 to 19 went to high school. About 10 million European immigrants became American citizens at public schools. Here is an example of a Catholic community that set up a patriarchal school. Industrial development changed the nation's educational needs. Research universities emerged courses in modern languages, physical science, psychology, and sociology.
Hi, I'm Naya. Today I'm going to be talking to you about 20th century discrimination and the quick spread of culture. Although we saw an end to slavery after the Civil War and the nationwide acceptance of the 13th Amendment, discrimination across America definitely persisted. This was commonly seen in public places as African Americans were forced to use different bathrooms, water fountains, and often schools. This legal system that supported racism was known as the Jim Crow laws. The Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson secured the legal right to segregate in public. Another type of discrimination against African Americans and immigrants was through legalities, including voting restriction. White people with legislative powers created voter ID laws and literacy tests that made it harder for African Americans specifically to register for voting, meaning the presidential elections were commonly swayed towards racist white voters. In a time span of 10 years in the late 1800s, more than 1,400 African Americans were killed and led to a huge northern uprising against whites called the New York Race Riots. Meanwhile, middle-class Northerners were enhancing industry by spreading mass culture nationwide. After the Reconstruction period, Americans had much more time on their hands for leisurely activities. This led to quick development of sports leagues such as baseball and tennis, amusement parks, and appreciation of liberal arts. Newspapers began circulating around the country to spread news quicker, and art became appreciated in a more abstract sense. This appreciation took a huge leap with the development of the Ashcan School and designed by Robert Henry to spark cultural awareness of over a wide spectrum of different forms of art. Within this era, many famous authors came to be, some of whom we still study and appreciate today, like Mark Twain, otherwise known as Samuel Langhorne Clemens. So this is how society basically developed at the turn of the 20th century, as far as social relations and how discrimination played a huge part in that, and simple daily life that later included events of leisure. During the 1870s and 80s, the South passed discriminatory laws called the Jim Crow laws to separate people of color in public. Here is a sign directing white and black people to separate bathrooms. Here is a sign explaining the meaning behind the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case. This case allowed the continuation of the Jim Crow laws and upheld the notion of people being, quote, separate but equal for about 60 years. The New York race riots started in 1900 because a black man believed that a white police officer had harmed his wife, and therefore he killed the officer. This started a huge violent uprising as depicted in the picture above. Baseball developed as a professional sport in 1845, and by 1855 had about 50 different clubs and teams. The first World Series was in 1903. Modern tennis came to be in 1873. Though many women enjoyed the sport and the attire, men of the early 20th century loved tennis just as much, as well as cycling. The Ashcan School of Liberal Arts not only appreciated the arts on a wide spectrum, but focused heavily on realism, realistic, gritty painting, like this one. Robert Henry often depicted urban life and people working in his art.